On November 15, 1923, in Berlin, Weimar shocked introduced a new mark. Prices stopped running. Shops reopened. The arithmetic stabilized, but the rescue came after the losses had already been assigned. 1. Rented mark replaced 1 trillion paper marks. This is not fiction. This was Germany 1923, and that is the part most people get backwards. The official memory says Germany was rescued when the new currency arrived, but the forensic record says something colder. Stability came after the liquidation, not before. The new unit was introduced in mid-November 1923, and the paper mark was fixed at 1 trillion to 1, only after the old claims had already been gutted. Here is the inversion. Hyperinflation was not just a collapse in prices, it was a sorting machine. If you lived on a salary adjusted too slowly, a pension set in law, a savings book, an insurance contract, or cash held for the future, you were feeding that machine. If you held assets that could reprice, or debts that inflation could erase, you were on the other side of it. Modern research on firm balance sheets in 1919 to 2023 finds exactly that pattern. Inflation crushed real debt burdens for leveraged firms while the value of fixed nominal claims was destroyed, and you can see it at street level. In October 1923, Victor Klemperer, a professor in Dresden keeping a daily diary, wrote that his remaining shares, cash at home, and life insurance had effectively been wiped out. That is what stabilization looked like from below. Not relief. Aftermath. So the real question is not how shock stopped the panic. It is why the state could stop it only after the middle class had already been broken. The collapse did not begin with a crowd losing its mind. It began with a state making a choice. January 1923. French and Belgian troops entered the Ruhr after Germany defaulted on reparation deliveries. The Ruhr was not symbolic ground. It was the industrial core of the country. Coal, steel, transport, output, the part of Germany that still turned claims into goods, and Berlin answered with passive resistance. That phrase sounds clean now, almost noble. It was not clean, it was expensive. Chancellor Wilhelm Kuno told workers, officials, and firms not to cooperate with the occupation. Mines slowed. Rail movement was obstructed. Deliveries stopped. And the Reich paid people to remain idle or to maintain operations without producing for the occupiers. In practice, the government chose to fund industrial stoppage with money claims, while the real output base was shrinking. That is the mechanism. Not printing in the lazy abstract sense. Printing against lost production. Claims rising while goods did not. If you want to know why the mark died in 1923, start there. A government can create paper liabilities overnight. It cannot create coal, freight capacity, machine parts, and export earnings overnight. Once the Ruhr stoppage widened, the state was paying wages into a bottleneck. More claims, fewer goods. That gap is where the currency begins to tear, and the official story usually stops too early. It says, reparations, occupation, money printing, collapse. True, but incomplete, because passive resistance also changed who got hit first. If you were close to the state, to payroll administration, to industrial compensation, you were inside the flow of emergency money. If you were living on previously accumulated savings, on an insurance policy, on a pension fixed in nominal terms, you were not inside that flow at all. You were holding yesterday's promise while the state was manufacturing today's claims. Different position, different fate. Why does that matter? Because hyperinflation is not only a monetary event, it is a queue. And the people at the back of that queue are always the same. Savers, pensioners, salary earners paid in intervals. Anyone whose claim arrives late, by mid to late 1923, the consequences were visible everywhere. Workers paid by the hour rushed to spend wages before prices moved again. A loaf of bread reached hundreds of billions of marks by autumn. The financial system broke down under the strain of supporting the Ruhr stoppage and the wider inflation spiral. So the beginning of this story is not greed, not hysteria, not wheelbarrows. It is a political decision to defend national resistance with paper claims faster than the economy could redeem them. And once that decision was made, the middle class was already standing in the wrong place. Here is what hyperinflation actually attacked. Not wealth in the abstract, deferred life, anything you were supposed to receive later, anything adjusted slowly, anything written down as a promise, a pension, a salary paid at intervals, a savings account, a life insurance policy, a government obligation, a contract with a date on it. Those were the targets. And that matters because the middle class lived inside those instruments, not as speculation, as discipline, as virtue. You worked. You deferred consumption. You trusted the arithmetic. Then the arithmetic turned on you. This is where the street-level record becomes more useful than theory. In February 1923, a Berlin resident identified only as Wolfgang wrote to Edgar Stillman Kelly in America that the dollar check he had received was already worth far less than expected because the mark had fallen so quickly. He described old women in his building living on small pensions and wrote that almost every week someone dies of exhaustion, starved to death. He also listed basic prices, including milk and bread, because daily life had become a race between money received and food still available. That is the mechanism at household level. You are not ruined because you are careless. You are ruined because your claim moved too slowly. And the people nearest the price switch lived in a different world. By 1923, prices in Germany were rising not by month, but within the day. Contemporary summaries note that prices often rose several times in a single day, while shops closed or stopped normal trade and some transactions shifted into barter or alternative currencies. Britannica's summary of the crisis describes shopkeepers unable to replenish stock fast enough, pensioners starving, and food disorders spreading as money lost meaning in real time. So think about the split. If you were paid weekly, you were behind. If you were paid monthly, you were dead on arrival. If you lived on a pension fixed in nominal terms, the collapse was not dramatic. It was administrative. The number still arrived. It just no longer commanded food, but if you ran a shop, held inventory, or could mark prices upward before restocking, you had a chance. Not safety, a chance. Repricing power became survival power. And this is why the visual cliches mislead people. The wheelbarrow matters less than the timing. The stack of notes matters less than the interval. A salary earner experienced inflation from behind. A merchant experienced it from inside. A pensioner experienced it after the fact. Same currency, different position in the sequence. And once you see that, Chapter 4 becomes obvious. Hyperinflation did not treat all holders of money the same. It separated paper claims from real collateral. And then it rewarded the side that could move first. Now look at the other side of the ledger. A household with a savings book and a firm with a warehouse full of goods were not holding the same kind of wealth. They were both denominated in marks on paper, but only one of them could survive repricing. This is the detail most people never hear. Inflation did not hit all balance sheets evenly. In Weimar Germany, firms with nominal debts and real assets were not simply damaged by the storm. Many were carried by it. Recent firm-level research on 1919 to 1923 shows that inflation sharply reduced real debt burdens, lowered interest expense in real terms, and especially benefited more leveraged, non-financial firms. Those firms saw larger increases in employment, book equity, and market valuations during the inflation. Bankruptcies also fell through this debt inflation channel. Read that again. The same event that destroyed fixed savings could improve the position of a leveraged firm because the debt stayed nominal. The assets did not. If you owned inventories, land, plant, machinery, or anything you could sell at the new price, the mark's collapse did not erase your world in the same way. It distorted it. It made planning harder. It made replacement uncertain. It broke contracts. But it also inflated away yesterday's liabilities while the physical collateral remained. And that created a brutal divergence. If you were a clerk, a teacher, a widow on a pension, or a family that had done the respectable thing and accumulated cash savings, your balance sheet was mostly deferred claims, future payments, fixed numbers, institutional promises. Those promises were being repriced against you. But if you were a Berlin firm with stock on hand and bank debt behind you, the sequence could run in your favor. You sold at today's price. You were paid with yesterday's money. And every turn of that wheel pushed savers lower and debtors upward. Not morally. Mechanically. That is why middle-class liquidation is not rhetorical excess. It is a description of who held the wrong instrument at the wrong time. And it also explains why the social memory of 1923 was so toxic. The losers were not gamblers. They were often the disciplined households the old order had trained to trust paper claims. The relative winners were not always more productive or more far-sighted. Many were simply positioned closer to assets that repriced and liabilities that did not. Same country, same currency collapse, different legal form of wealth. That is the hinge. Because once debts had been inflated away and deferred claims had been extinguished, stabilization does not rewind the system. It ratifies the result. By the time stabilization arrived, the sorting had already happened. That is the buried lead. The Rentenmark was introduced in November 1923 at the famous rate of 1 to 1 trillion against the old paper mark. Schacht then enforced monetary restraint at the Reichsbank, and the spiral stopped with startling speed. Prices stabilized. Arithmetic returned. The unit held. But stabilization is not restitution. It does not travel backward through the contracts that were just destroyed. It does not refill the savings book. It does not reconstruct the pension that bought meat in 1918 and bought almost nothing in late 1923. This is where the official memory becomes misleading. The success of the Rentenmark was real as a monetary operation. Modern scholarship and historical summaries agree on that much, but they also show that the old paper mark collapse had already wiped out large nominal debts, gutted fixed claims, and forced a reset in financial relationships before the new unit was established. In other words, stabilization ended the panic after the balance sheet revolution had already occurred, and then law stepped in. Some contracts were effectively buried with the old mark. Some debts had already been inflated away. Some obligations, especially mortgages, later became subject to revaluation fights precisely because the liquidation had been so lopsided. That tells you everything. The state was not restoring the old order. It was negotiating the consequences of its disappearance. So when people say Germany was saved in November 1923, be precise about what was saved. The currency mechanism was saved. Commercial calculation was saved. A functioning price system was saved. The middle-class claim structure was not. And that is the pattern that survives far beyond Weimar. Institutions can preserve system function. They can stop the visible panic. They can even restore a credible unit. But by the time that happens, your legal claim may already be history. On paper, stabilization looks like rescue. Forensically, it often means the losses have been finalized. So what survives from 1923 is not the photograph, not the wheelbarrow, the pattern. A currency breaks fast enough, and the real divide is no longer rich versus poor. It becomes repricers versus claim holders, asset holders versus promise holders, people inside the flow versus people waiting for the transfer to clear. That is the modern parallel, not spectacle, structure, because this is what institutions can still do. They can preserve system function after household balance sheets have already been broken. They can keep payments moving, keep shops open, keep the unit stable enough for trade, and you may still discover that what you thought you stored was never really stored at all. That is why the social memory mattered. The people broken by 1923 were not irrational. They were often the most obedient participants in the old order. They saved in the approved instruments. They accepted delayed payment. They trusted legal claims to preserve time, and the forensic record gives you a hard conclusion. Do not confuse nominal stability with restored justice. Do not confuse a functioning system with your position inside it, because when the rules change under pressure, what survives is not the promise, It is the thing that can live through repricing. That leaves you with a binary choice. You can trust nominal claims as stored life, or you can treat every promise as a structure that must survive a rule change before you call it savings.